it appeared many times it was just kind of like a catch-22, in that, right, he is doing things that is absolutely leading the way, right, for those behind him, future Black entertainers that weren't even born yet, let's say, to be able to get opportunities and do things that had never been done before. Now, with that said, though, um, he had to make compromises. I won't speculate on, what had to be done versus what wasn't, but that's what it was. Um, what are your thoughts around that, in terms of that whole kind of, dichotomy of, being the first, but right, so you're doing something really great on one side, but you also could be perceived as an Uncle Tom, on the other side by your people, right?
Yeah,
Your peers. So I mean, what are your thoughts around that?
that's a real interesting question because that was one of the things that bothered Sonny Murray uh, before he started on his investigation because he didn't like Sammy.
Mm,
He thought he was an Uncle Tom. His parents loved Sammy uh, because Sonny's father, Albert Sr., was the first Black judge in Brooklyn
mhm.
in the middle of the century. Uh, and they, as I mentioned, they opened the first and only Black resort in the Poconos. So they were trailblazers themselves. Uh, but as Sonny got to know Sammy in terms of investigating his life, he got to respect him. And I think Sammy had to make choices, especially during that time. I mean, that period of time, I mean, despite everything that's going on today,
Mhm.
when we're talking about social justice and whatnot, it was it was a lot worse back then in the 50s and 60s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. He went through some terrible times in World War II.
Yep.
He was forced to do some really humiliating things. Uh, Dealt with it again in the 50s. Had to stay in certain hotels when he played in Las Vegas. Couldn't stay on the Strip. Uh, but when he basically chose when he would do something. He would kind of think of it in modern day times like LeBron James and say Michael Jordan,
Mhm.
where LeBron's pretty vocal in terms of speaking out on certain things,
Yes.
and Michael is much more reserved, in terms of his history when it comes to that. And doesn't mean either of them is right or wrong. It's just how they handle it, how they feel comfortable handling it. There were a lot of people back in the 60s who thought Sammy should have been far more vocal than he was, but he was there with Dr. Martin Luther King at Selma in
Yes.
the early 1960s. He was there and he marched with them. I'll tell you one story. Which I write in the book. I mean, it's kind of a small story, but it's kind of indicative of who Sammy was. And that was when he was recording an album, and he goes in and he sees all these white musicians, and he's like, "Wait a minute, you can't find a Black saxophonist,
Mhm.
you can't find other Black musicians," and he walked out. You know, those where he picked some small battles,
Yeah.
think he knew he could win. Other times, I mean, there was one scene though, there's one picture which infuriated Black America, uh, and that was when he was seen hugging Richard Nixon in 1972. Right? You recall that
Right.
picture?
Yes, I do recall it. Yes, he
So
came up
everyone,
behind Nixon and hugged him
right?
from behind.
I mean, he just inflamed Black America. They were just like, "What are you doing?" What no one realized was that this goes back to the mob history and the fact that Sammy was told to go to that convention because the Teamsters were run by the mob.
Mhm.
Okay, the mob ran Sammy and others. Sammy would have to go play birthday parties of different mob guys. I write about that. He'd go to Cleveland. His
Mhm.
lawyer at that time, or later on, was this guy named John Clamacca, who was the lawyer for a bunch of mob guys in Cleveland, who ran the Teamsters Central States Fund, huge pension fund. And Sammy was beholden to them, and they were supporting Nixon at that period of time. Sammy, go to Miami, go stand there with Richard Nixon. I think the hug was just something that happened. It was spontaneous,
Right. Sure.
but he had to be there. He had no choice. But he couldn't come out and say publicly, "Well, my mob guys that are backing me or who have been pulling my strings for all these years told me I had to go." He couldn't say that. So, there were times like that where he was completely misunderstood because it was something where he had to do. And there are other times where he wanted to do things because he thought he would be changing things.
So let's talk about something else. We're going to move into, I guess, family. We'll talk about family, and of all of the greats that I've ever read about, or watched a documentary on. And when I say great, I'm talking about, right, an international star, famous, global recognition, um, complete financial freedom, et cetera, is what I'm defining that as. It seems like, those individuals never get to have it all. And when I say all, I'm talking about having a wonderful, amazing, loving family, and the family structure stays intact, and you still get to enjoy that celebrity. Um, what are your thoughts about that? And specifics around Sammy's life and even beyond it, and just different stories, research that you've done. Is it possible to have both?
It's possible. I mean, it depends on the individual, obviously,
Mhm.
and their foundation and their ability to have relationships. For Sammy, he was in love, so he married my Brit. So this is kind of a famous story. A lot of younger people won't know about this, obviously, because it was 60 years ago, but caused a lot of controversy. She was a Swedish actress, right?
Mhm.
But he was in love with her, and they had a daughter named Tracy, and then they ended up adopting two sons. But then they divorced in the mid 1960s. So now, one of the great things about this book was the access I had to his family.
Mhm.
In that, when I called Tracy Davis, so there have been so many books that have been written about Sammy that didn't necessarily touch on what was really going on or tell his story.
Right.
And so when I first reached out to Tracy Davis, and she was, okay, right, you're gonna do a book. And I told her where I was going with the book. She became far more interested in it, and then she really helped me a lot. She was just,
Oh, awesome.
she was valuable. And we met in LA, and we actually went to a restaurant and a bar, a famous bar that her father and others would go to, and we would talk. And she wanted this story told. And so she introduced me to her mother, and
Mhm.
who's a very, here's a woman who was a famous actress at one point in time, and now she's just, really wonderful woman. Very nice to talk to, very pleasant. Um, and so Sammy was not the best father. In fact, he was an awful father. I mean, he even missed his daughter's graduation. Promised he'd be there, you know, missed it. Was always out traveling around the world, didn't give the attention that his family needed, basically wrote the bill, took care of the bills, gave them money, checks. They didn't
Right.
have the emotional support that, a child would want or a wife would want. And then the sons, so the adopted sons, Jeff was, I mean, I felt so bad for him because he had actually toured with Sammy. He spent a lot of time with him. And yet still really didn't think he got to know his father. We had, he was working in a warehouse. This is in 2007. I was out there
Mhm.
and talking to him, and he was working in a warehouse at some point in time. I mean, you're thinking of Sammy Davis Jr. made millions of dollars, and here's his family years later. They're struggling. They're trying to make
Yeah.
it in the world, doing this and doing that. Tracy's trying to get hold of her father's legacy. Jeff is just trying to make it, just trying to pay the bills. And so I had a lot of empathy for Jeff. So it can be difficult leading that kind of life, and we've read it so many times. I
Sure.
mean, you see celebrity divorces, but there are celebrity magic marriages that do make it. It really depends on the individual, just like in anything in life.